Fragmented records, fragmented self. You fill out a form and hesitate at a basic question: your address, your employment status, your relationship to a household, because none of the available boxes match how you actually live. Later, a denial or delay arrives, not because you acted wrongly, but because the version of you inside a database could not be reconciled with the version of you at the counter. This is a familiar friction. Life is continuous, but institutions require discrete entries. The stakes are not only convenience. The accumulated record becomes a practical identity that can outrank your own account of yourself. When every institution stores a different version of you, identity becomes a negotiated interface between lived experience and proxy records, and the system's incentives quietly decide which version counts. This reflection will not claim that institutions are uniquely malicious, nor that a single correction could restore a unified self. It will not offer a program, a checklist, or a remedy. It will claim something narrower, that the gap between person and profile is not an accident, but a structural trade-off produced by measurement under constraint, and that the resulting fragmentation is a predictable outcome of optimization through proxies. Let us examine the structure. Begin with a plain observation. Identity has always had multiple contexts. A person is not identical at work and at home, not identical under pressure and at rest. Yet the present tension is not merely contextual variation. It is the formalization of context into durable, portable records that travel without you, update without you, and often outlast the moment that created them. To speak clearly, we must define a few terms. First, a record. A record is a stored claim about you that is legible to an institution. It may be a form entry, a credential, a transaction history, a case note, an attendance log, a score, a label, a decision outcome. A record is not inherently false. It is inherently partial. It is a snapshot taken for a purpose, under time pressure, using a limited vocabulary. A record is created because an institution must act at scale, and acting at scale requires that the world be made readable. Second, a profile. A profile is a compiled picture made from many records, often across time, sometimes across domains. It is not simply a list. It is an interpretation. Categories are applied, probabilities are inferred, risk is estimated, eligibility is predicted. A profile is the record system's attempt to substitute for knowing you. Its power is practical. It is easier to move a profile through a workflow than to move a whole person through deliberation. Third, a proxy. A proxy is a measurable stand-in for something that matters but cannot be directly measured at scale. Institutions rarely measure what they truly value, because what they truly value is complex. Competence, trustworthiness, stability, need, intent, potential, contribution, harm avoided, dignity preserved. Instead, they measure what they can count: credential completion, payment history, test scores, punctuality, frequency, consistency, flag behaviors, verified facts. A proxy can be useful, but it is always a trade-off. Proxies invite error in two directions: false confidence when the proxy looks good but meaning is absent, and false suspicion when meaning is present but the proxy looks irregular. Fourth, a version of you. This phrase needs discipline. It does not mean multiple souls or multiple realities. It means multiple operational definitions, the you that a system can recognize and process. The version of you in a payroll system is different from the version of you in a licensing database, which is different from the version of you in a health record, which is different from the version of you implied by a purchase log or a support ticket. Each is anchored to a purpose: pay wages, certify compliance, track treatment, reduce fraud, allocate attention. The system's you is built from whichever variables are convenient for its objective. Now name the assumptions that often go unstated. Assumption 1. Institutions must make decisions under constraint. They operate with finite time, limited staff, limited budgets, legal exposure, and a mandate to be consistent. Consistency is not a moral achievement, it is an operational requirement. A workflow that makes exceptions for every story collapses under volume. Assumption 2. The self is not fully expressible in data. Even honest data is incomplete. Even complete data would not settle meaning. Human identity includes motives, relationships, commitments, and changes of mind, features that are real but do not fit cleanly into a schema. Assumption 3, records will be treated as if they were reality, because they are actionable. Meaning is rich but slow, a metric is thin but fast. When decisions must be made quickly and defensively, measurable proxies become the default language. With these terms and assumptions, we can distinguish metric from meaning. A metric is what the system can count, compare, and audit. Meaning is what the person experiences, intends, and becomes. Metrics are not useless, they are incomplete. Meaning is not illegible, it is expensive to process. This is the foundation of the core question: who are you when every institution stores a different version of you? In plain terms, who are you when the practical world treats you as a mosaic of proxies? The question sounds philosophical, but it is also administrative. It concerns whether your life is governed by interpretation or by inscription, whether your identity is primarily formed through relationship and reflection, or through the accumulation of institutional claims that become hard to contest. The point is not that we should abolish records. Records are how large systems coordinate. The point is that records are not neutral mirrors. They are instruments. They reveal what an institution is built to notice, what it is built to ignore, and what it is built to protect itself against. The central paradox is this: institutions pursue fairness and efficiency by standardizing identity, yet the person becomes less fairly treated and less accurately known as standardization increases. To act at scale, a system must reduce complexity. It must translate the thick, irregular, evolving human life into stable fields. This translation creates legibility. Legibility makes coordination possible. Coordination makes services possible. And yet the same translation strips context, compresses nuance, and hardens old states into persistent labels. This is not merely a technical tension, it is an incentive tension. Institutions face incentives to be consistent, auditable, and defensible. Consistency reduces accusations of favoritism. Auditability reduces internal uncertainty. Defensibility reduces liability and reputational risk. These incentives push toward using the same proxies for everyone, the same thresholds, the same categories, the same checks. The institution's identity system is not built primarily to understand you. It is built to ensure that the institution can justify its decisions. A person, however, experiences identity as continuity across change, growth, setbacks, reorientation, redefinition. The person values being known in context. The person values being allowed to be more than the last recorded incident, the last score, the last missed payment, the last gap in employment, the last mismatch. Here the proxy problem intensifies. Systems confuse measurable stability with actual stability, credential presence with competence, lack of flagged events with trustworthiness, frequent engagement with commitment, high score with readiness. Proxies are attractive because they compress uncertainty into a number or category, but compression has failure modes. Consider two different optimization goals that are often in conflict: speed and safety. Speed demands automation, templates, and pre-filled decisions. Safety demands verification, review, and appeal pathways. When speed wins, the system relies more heavily on pre-existing records. When safety wins, the system relies more heavily on documentation and proofs. Both can intensify fragmentation. Speed creates more decisions based on thin profiles. Safety creates more demands for identity proofs that generate more records, more checkpoints, more chances for mismatch. Now add the tension between fairness and personalization. Fairness is operationalized as treat like cases alike. But to identify like cases, the system must define which features count as the case. That definition is value-laden. It encodes what the institution believes matters. Personalization, on the other hand, tries to incorporate more features, more context, more history, yet personalization often means deeper profiling. It increases the reach of proxies into areas previously private or irrelevant. The institution may call this better service. The person may experience it as being followed by earlier versions of themselves. The failure modes appear at both the individual level and the system level. Individual level failure mode 1, self-alienation by administrative repetition. When you are repeatedly asked to describe yourself in categories that do not fit, you learn to translate yourself into the system's language. You become skilled at presenting a legible version. This can be rational, but over time the legible version can begin to feel more real than the lived one, because the legible one has consequences. The person starts anticipating which traits will be punished and which will be rewarded, and identity becomes a strategy for passing filters. This is not moral weakness, it is adaptation to incentives. Individual level failure mode 2, identity hardening through record inertia. Records have momentum. A mistaken entry, an outdated status, an old address, a misapplied label. These can persist because correcting them is costly, slow, or opaque. The institution then treats the record as the stable object and the person as the variable. This reverses the human expectation. The person experiences a peculiar burden, being required to argue with their own shadow. Now system-level failure mode 1, proxy drift and Goodhart pressure. When a proxy becomes a target, behavior shifts toward optimizing the proxy. Institutions may intend to measure competence, the system ends up measuring test performance. Institutions may intend to measure reliability, the system ends up measuring compliance with documentation norms. Institutions may intend to measure need, the system ends up measuring the ability to navigate forms. The measured variable becomes less connected to the thing it was supposed to represent. This drift is not necessarily caused by deception, it is caused by incentives. If the gate rewards the proxy, the population adapts. System-level failure mode 2, fragmentation through uncoordinated schemas. Different institutions define the person differently because their purposes differ. One needs a household definition, another needs an employment definition, another needs a residency definition, another needs a risk category. Each creates fields that solve its own local problem. The result is a patchwork of identities that do not reconcile. When systems attempt to interoperate, mismatches appear. Name formats, dates, addresses, categories, status codes, eligibility rules. The system interprets mismatch as suspicion or error because mismatch threatens the integrity of the workflow. This creates a paradox. The more systems try to synchronize identity, the more brittle the person becomes to mismatch. Integration promises unity but often delivers a single point of failure. A consolidated identity is efficient, but it also amplifies error. A wrong entry in one place can propagate. A disputed fact can become a pervasive friction. There is also the paradox of visibility. Institutions often claim that more data increases accuracy and fairness. In some contexts it does, but more data also increases the surface area for misinterpretation. It increases the number of features that can be used as proxies for other features. It increases the probability that a past moment is treated as a permanent trait. It increases the chance that correlation is treated as explanation, and yet institutions cannot simply refuse data, because refusing data is also a choice with consequences. Without data, decisions may become more arbitrary. Without records, the person may have to repeatedly prove basic facts. Without profiles, eligibility may become inconsistent. The problem is not that data exists. The problem is that data becomes identity by default, because it is the most portable and enforceable representation available. This is the heart of the tension. Identity as lived continuity versus identity as institutional artifact. One is thick, slow, and relational. The other is thin, fast, and actionable. When they conflict, the actionable often wins. The temptation is to resolve this tension by choosing a side, either defend the person against the system, or defend the system against the person. That is a false clarity. The actual structure is a set of trade-offs imposed by scale, risk, and limited attention. Attention is the scarce resource here. To pay attention to a person in context is costly. To pay attention to a record is cheap. Systems economize attention through proxies. People then reorganize their lives around what receives attention. Efficiency reveals values. When a system chooses which details are worth capturing and which are worth ignoring, it reveals what it values, what it is willing to spend attention on, and what it is willing to treat as noise. The difference between identity as something you author and identity as something you negotiate. In many domains, you do not author your institutional identity. You submit inputs, the system outputs categories. You can sometimes appeal, sometimes correct, sometimes annotate, but the power to define the schema belongs to the institution. The institution decides which questions can be asked and which answers are acceptable. It decides which proofs count. It decides the cost of disputing a record. That is not an incidental detail. That is where identity becomes governance. Second-order effects are what happen when a system changes the environment in which choices are made. No malice is required. A few persistent effects follow from fragmented institutional identity. First consequence: behavior shifts toward legibility. When access to services, opportunities, or basic functioning depends on what a profile can see, people adapt by becoming easier to classify. They keep paperwork not because they value paperwork, but because paperwork stabilizes their institutional identity. They avoid irregular paths, not because they are wrong, but because irregularity produces mismatches. They choose actions that preserve continuity in records, staying at an address longer than preferred, avoiding changes that would trigger re-verification, keeping a job title stable, maintaining a predictable pattern of activity. This is not a narrative of fear. It is an ordinary response to friction. When the cost of being misrecognized is high, people invest in being recognizable. Identity becomes partly an exercise in administrative risk management. Second consequence: inequality shifts from resources to navigation. In a record-driven environment, the capacity to manage profiles becomes a form of power. Some people have time, literacy, stable access to documentation, and familiarity with institutional language. Others do not. Two people with the same underlying reality can be treated differently because one can produce a coherent institutional version and the other cannot. This is a subtle consequence because it hides behind the rhetoric of neutrality. The system treats everyone according to the same rules, yet the rules are easier for some to satisfy. The proxy becomes a test of navigability. Third consequence: the past becomes operationally heavier. Lived identity includes forgetting, forgiveness, change, maturation, and the reinterpretation of one's own history. Institutional identity often lacks these capacities. Records make the past more retrievable, more portable, more resistant to reinterpretation. This can be beneficial for continuity of care, accountability, and safety. It can also mean that old states persist as present constraints. The second-order effect is that time ceases to heal certain mismatches because the mismatch is stored. The person may have moved on, but the profile continues to speak in the present tense. Fourth consequence: trust is replaced by verification. Where identity is fragmented and consequential, institutions become cautious. Caution translates into verification steps, documentation requirements, cross-checks. Verification reduces some forms of error. It also increases the burden of proof on the individual. The individual must repeatedly prove stable facts because the institution cannot afford to trust context. The second-order effect is a change in the texture of social interaction. Interactions become less about relationship and more about compliance with process. People learn that being believed is less relevant than being verifiable. Fifth consequence: error becomes systemic, not personal. In fragmented identity systems, a single error can create cascading friction. A mismatch triggers a flag. The flag triggers extra review. Extra review slows processing. Delays create further mismatches in other systems. The person's profile becomes a record of friction. What began as a typo becomes a pattern. This is a second-order effect because it is produced by the coupling of systems. Each system is trying to protect itself. Together, they create a feedback loop. Mismatch produces suspicion. Suspicion produces scrutiny. Scrutiny produces more data. More data produces more opportunities for mismatch. Sixth consequence: authenticity becomes a managed performance. When institutions respond to the profile rather than the person becomes incentivized to curate the profile. This can be as simple as selecting the safest option on a form, or as complex as shaping one's life to fit expected patterns. The person learns which statements are costly and which are neutral. Over time, the distinction between what is true and what is institutionally safe becomes salient. The system does not have to demand dishonesty for this to occur. It only has to reward legibility and punish ambiguity. Ambiguity is expensive to process. People reduce ambiguity when it has a cost. Seventh consequence: institutions become more confident than they should. A profile looks coherent because it is formatted. It has fields, categories, scores, and histories. Coherence in representation is not the same as coherence in reality. Yet formatted data often produces an illusion of completeness. This is a known failure mode. The cleaner the interface, the easier it is to forget what was excluded. The second-order effect is policy and decision-making that overestimates what the system knows. Decisions become harder to contest because the record appears objective. The person's counter-narrative is treated as subjective and subjectivity is treated as noise. Eighth consequence, identity becomes modular and responsibility becomes ambiguous. When your life is split across many institutional versions, it becomes difficult to locate accountability when harm occurs. One office points to another. One record system cites another system's input. The person is trapped between schemas. This is not necessarily evasion. It is an emergent property of distributed responsibility. The more identity is distributed, the more blame is diffused. A final consequence that deserves careful phrasing: moral language becomes less available. Not morality in the sense of proclamations, but moral language in the sense of describing what matters. When systems speak in proxies, people are pressured to speak in proxies too. Worth becomes credit, need becomes eligibility, commitment becomes engagement, trust becomes score. The vocabulary of meaning narrows to the vocabulary of measurement. This narrowing is persistent because it is efficient. It is also costly because it displaces nuance. It changes what can be said about a person in institutional space, and therefore what can be recognized. These consequences persist because they are not mistakes in code or policy. They are stable outcomes of incentives: scale, risk reduction, consistency, auditability, throughput. Unless those incentives change, the fragmentation will not vanish. It will only become more finely managed. Return to the question, who are you, when every institution stores a different version of you? One answer is administrative. You are the intersection of your records. That is the answer the system tends to enact. It is not a philosophical stance. It is a workflow. It treats the person as a composite of eligible states and verified facts. Another answer is experiential. You are the continuity that persists across contexts, even when no schema can capture it. That continuity includes memory, intention, obligation, and change. But this answer, while meaningful, is not always actionable in institutional space. The tension remains because each side is solving a real problem. Institutions cannot operate solely on narrative without collapsing under ambiguity. People cannot live solely as profiles without collapsing under reduction. The paradox is not that one side is wrong, it is that each side becomes destructive when it forgets its limits. A disciplined way to hold this is to observe where attention goes. When your attention is captured by maintaining coherence across records, identity becomes a maintenance task. When institutional attention is captured by guarding against risk, identity becomes a suspicion management task. These are not personal failings, they are predictable adaptations within a feedback loop. Reflection, then, is not a demand for purity or a return to some imagined unified self. Reflection is a practice of noticing the proxies that are shaping behavior. Notice how often legitimacy is granted through documentation rather than through understanding. Notice how often ambiguity is punished as if it were deception. Notice how often the effort to be consistent produces inconsistent outcomes because the proxy does not track the reality. Notice how often a person is asked to become their own data custodian, carrying proofs from one desk to another, translating themselves into a sequence of acceptable statements. And notice, too, the unavoidable value conflicts. A system that allows easy reinvention reduces the weight of old records, but it also reduces accountability and continuity. A system that preserves continuity strengthens coordination, but it also strengthens the persistence of error and stigma. A system that personalizes decisions may improve fit, but it may require deeper surveillance. A system that minimizes data collection may reduce exposure, but it may increase arbitrariness and bias. No clean resolution appears because the underlying goods are real and intention. Dignity and legibility, mercy and audit, flexibility and integrity, privacy and coordination, speed and care. What remains is not an answer, but a constraint-aware posture. To treat any single institutional version of a person as partial. To treat any single proxy as provisional. To treat any workflow that claims to fully capture identity as a failure mode waiting for scale. There is a quiet danger in optimizing identity systems without reflection. The more efficient the classification, the more we forget that classification is not the person. When the proxy is mistaken for the self, the system becomes certain and the person becomes small. The question can therefore be left open in a more precise form. How many versions of you can a society store before it stops noticing that it is storing versions? And what kind of person is formed when living requires constant negotiation with those stored versions? There is no closure here, only a boundary. Records can coordinate action, but they cannot complete meaning. The gap will remain, and in that gap, identity is either reduced by default or attended to with restraint.